and Annabel Denham, senior political commentator and columnist at The Telegraph. So welcome back to both of you. And we've dealt with lots of the front page stories today. So this hour we're kind of delving inside, aren't we? And you've picked out a few interesting stories. Annabel, kick us off with the Daily Mail's take on the 16th resident doctors' strike that was announced this week.
And unsurprisingly, given that we are on the 16th in about 3 years, the public are getting a little fatigued with it all. The BMA has obviously announced that junior doctors will walk out for 4 days in mid-June, and a YouGov survey has subsequently found that 52% oppose this industrial action. Now, what is interesting is that if you look at polling from summer in 2024, 52% supported the industrial action. So that really just goes to show how much public sentiment has shifted. And I think there are a number of reasons for this. I think that previously the BMA was able to make a bit of a public enemy of the Conservative government and to argue that they had been very mean-spirited, that they had resisted pay rises that doctors felt that they deserved. I think that there was a lot of latent sort of hangover sympathy for doctors in the aftermath of the COVID pandemic, because they were the people who were on the coalface, on the front line, often putting their own lives at risk in order to care for patients. Whereas now they're dealing with a Labour government. I do think that that sort of public sympathy has begun to wane. And just another sort of interesting aspect to this, of course, is just a few weeks ago, Wes Streeting resigned as Health Secretary, and James Murray, who was previously Chief Financial Secretary to the Treasury, became the new Health Secretary. And you do sort of wonder whether Wes Streeting, who is a very clever, very effective political operator, couldn't really have chosen his moment better to leave the NHS, because he did so at a time when news was breaking that waiting lists were finally beginning to come down, and just before the next round, possibly, of strikes.
Why do you think that public opinion has shifted against losing sympathy with the doctors? Do you think it's for the reasons that Annabel was suggesting, or do you think it's just that people will look at the pay rises that they've had so far and think, is that not enough? I just posed the question. I wonder what you think.
I think there are certainly a lot of factors at play when it comes to this, and Annabel's made some really good points, but I do agree also that people are really stretched for cash. And I think when you look at they've had a 34% pay rise cumulatively over the last few years, and that's the point that James Murray, the new Health Secretary, has been making, that they've been handed an awful lot of money, and I think that people naturally have quite a strong affinity with doctors. They feel like they work really hard, they work antisocial hours, and especially given the COVID pandemic, they've got a lot of respect for doctors, and they do feel like they deserve pay rises. However, I mean, just looking at the figures they're asking for, they're now asking for a 29% pay rise. It's a huge figure.
They're talking about pay restoration, aren't they? They're saying they're still paid less than they were in 2008 if you take inflation into account.
But I think a lot of people feel like they are worse off, and I think that people at the moment are really struggling, and I think that looking at the fact that they have had big chunks of pay rises to try and boost their salaries a little bit, and doctors are saying, look, we are not nearly at the salaries that we had in 2008, but I think a lot of people are losing sympathy now because they feel like they're not as well off as they were a few years ago. A lot of people are feeling worse off, and I think it means that there is now much less natural sympathy for doctors.
And I'll just add one additional point, which is the more that these strikes go on, the more I think that it's coming into the public consciousness that doctors, public sector staff, get extremely generous pensions, ones that those who are working in the private sector don't get. So public sector employer pensions contributions are around 3 times those in the private sector. So I just wonder whether there's also a sense that not only are the pay demands, perhaps unrealistic, but actually people are becoming increasingly aware that the wider package that doctors are getting isn't too bad.
At the same time, as you say, people appreciate their doctors, don't want them to be leaving the country and going and finding work elsewhere where they feel they'll be paid better.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would sort of say in defence of doctors here is that actually in the UK and the NHS, they do have a really difficult work package when it comes to where they're placed. My stepbrother's a doctor, and he now lives in New Zealand, but he was sent around the country. His partner was sent somewhere else. There was you don't have much choice about where you go, especially when you're a junior doctor, and your hours are really difficult and your working conditions aren't great. And also there were lots of doctors who were looking for jobs after they'd graduated because there weren't enough placements. So I do think it is a surprisingly difficult working environment, just as sort of the NHS as an employer. And I think that that's something that doctors are asking to be fixed. And I think that's an easier one to sell to the public than this massive pay rise.
Yeah, and James Murray certainly pushing back on the idea of a pay rise. He's basically said it's unaffordable. Let's move on to a story inside The Express. And this is Keir Starmer talking about, I think this might have been off the back of the Tony Blair criticisms we talked about in a previous hour this week. He did talk about some of the mistakes that he had made, although he did maintain he had the right course now, but one of the mistakes was the winter fuel allowance.
I mean, one of many, I think many members of the British public would think, but yes, he has given an assessment of his early period in Number 10 in response to that 5,000-word Blair essay that came out earlier this week, and he has admitted that the decision to end universal winter fuel payments was a mistake. Of course, that was one of Labour's very early U-turns. It's had about 14 or 15 U-turns since, and it was a deeply unpopular measure, and it revealed
and it was very early on, wasn't it? It wasn't in the manifesto, so it took people by surprise as well.
It was within the first month of Labour coming into power, and you know, if you want to trace back the steadily declining popularity in the polls, it really does go back to that moment. I think it revealed a lot about Starmerism as a project, because it seemed like a rather random policy. It was designed to try to reassure the markets, to insist that they were going to behave responsibly when it came to the economy, that they would be fiscally prudent, but they really misunderstood how incensed pensioners would be in response to this. The saving against, you know, the amount that the government is spending every year was a drop motion, and they were ultimately forced into that U-turn. But that summer of 2024 was just a disaster for Starmer, you know, because it wasn't just the winter fuel payment, but it was Wardrobe Gate, and the fact that whilst the PM was presenting himself as this paragon of moral probity, it turned out that he was getting freebies from a Labour donor. There were those 19 excruciating seconds when he went to Southpole in the aftermath of those dreadful murders, and he was heckled. And people felt that, unlike Tony Blair, after Princess Diana died, he really was the wrong man at the wrong moment. Then you've obviously have things like welfare reform. That's been very difficult for the Prime Minister. And the overarching, I think, problem has been really a lack of vision, that he knew how to win, but he didn't know how to govern. And the winter fuel payment is emblematic of that.
Well, yes. And what do you make of the fact that he's owned up to this? He said it's a mistake. I mean, is that refreshing for people, for him to sort of acknowledge that it hasn't all been perfect?
Yeah, I think it's good that he's acknowledged that things haven't been perfect, but I think that actually he did double down on an awful lot of things in that letter response, his sort of Substack post in response to Tony Blair. He was sort of saying that his mission for government is right. And yeah, I think it is good that Starmer owns up to his mistakes, because he's had a really difficult time in office. And that winter fuel sort of payment decision, it spent an awful lot of political capital. He did something that wasn't in the manifesto, as Annabelle said, and then he U-turned on it, so he didn't really make any savings. He sort of, when he reversed it, it was extended to almost all pensioners again. So I think that, yeah, it's good that he sort of admits it was a mistake, but I think a lot of people are saying that Starmer needs to really hold his hands up and say that his first 2 years in office just have completely not been what he planned for. A lot of people before the local elections, a lot of Labour MPs that I spoke to were saying that they wanted a total admission from Starmer that things had to change, and they kind of said that the only thing that would let them give their backing to Starmer was if he showed kind of total humility in how it had gone. And we didn't really see that. We saw a little bit of him taking responsibility for the local elections, but not enough, I think, for Labour MPs to accept real responsibility for how things have gone.
Yeah, I guess he's fighting for his job, isn't he? He wants to kind of maintain that he's the best man for it. Let's move on to the front page of the FT, which has a really interesting story about Durex sales.
Yes, you perhaps didn't think you'd be talking about condoms at 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning. But here we are. So sales of Durex condoms have plummeted after the Chinese government decided that it would end a tax break and clamp down on marketing of contraceptives. Now, this is a really interesting story just for China, because it was only 10 years since they ended the one-child policy, which was designed, of course, to reduce the number of children that Chinese parents were having, because they were so worried about population control and whether they would have enough food supply and whether the economic development could ultimately support support it. And now here we are in 2026, and they are worried about their plummeting fertility rate. And this isn't just a problem for China, it is a global phenomenon. It is expected that by the 2080s, the global population will peak at around 10.3 billion people, after which it will begin to decline. Now, many Western nations are already experiencing fertility rates far below the replacement rate that is required for a stable population. So in the UK, our fertility rate is around 1.4 children per mother, and it needs to be around 2.1. And it's
the real
something
reason,
that...
presumably, is all about people paying enough tax to support people in retirement and the welfare state.
Yes, so it's the worker to retiree ratio, essentially, which is going to go down from 1.4 today to 1.3 in the next couple of decades. And I just think it's one of those massive issues. It's a ticking time bomb, but it isn't a nettle any politician, any political party really wants to grasp, because it gets you into that slightly murky, uncomfortable territory of
telling people how to
behave, or
do you see this as a big issue?
Yeah, I think the problem that I see with it is that any policies that try to promote the birth rate put a lot more emphasis on women than on men, because obviously the women are the ones that are carrying the children, having to give birth. And normally women are the ones who take on much of the responsibility of having kids, the childcare responsibilities, and obviously when you've got a newborn, it's breastfeeding, and more women take a lot more time out of work than men do. So I think that it's just trying to be careful with any policies when you're looking to increase the birth rate, that you make sure it's easier to have children, more desirable to have children, and also spreading that burden when it comes to paternity leave and maternity leave, making sure that men and women are able to share that burden equally. And I think that's a really difficult policy point.
Very interesting indeed, and that's a kind of conversation we could keep going on. Who knew that condom sales would prompt such an interesting conversation? Let's talk about people talking to their pets. I think we've got less than a minute.
It's my favourite story.
Very quickly. You've got a dog.
I do have a dog.
Do you have conversations with your dog?
Conversation, perhaps
one-sided,
not.
maybe.
One-sided, exactly. Monologues with my pet. I'm just surprised that it's only around half of people who wish that they could talk to their animals and not hire. Not least given that if your dog talked back to you, you'd probably be a millionaire, billionaire.
Yeah, that's true.
I've got a cat and I definitely spend a lot of time talking to her. But I thought that some of the questions they were asking were quite bland. Do you like your life? What's your favourite thing we do together? I feel like there's more interesting things to chat about. They've seen your entire life. I don't know. I kind of want to know what she makes of me. Like, she sees my whole life. What's her take on that?
Yes, what am I doing wrong? Where am I going wrong?
What's your
It's my
opinion on
animal.
this?
No, that would be good, wouldn't it? Yeah, I don't know. I dread to think what they'd say.
Anyway, I don't want the answer.
My cats definitely are very sceptical about me, that's for sure.
Anyway, generally.
We're out of time. Million Annabelle, lovely to have your company this morning. Thank you.
The best thing about being a Sky News journalist